Welcome, everyone. Today we are going to discuss an article called The Feminist Case for Marriage, written by a woman named Louise. I will be sharing my thoughts on what she has to say, so let's start. In the early 1970s, on April 6, 2022, the United Kingdom became the first country in the world to legalize divorce without regard to fault. Since you no longer need a valid reason to file for divorce, I imagine there will be an increase in the number of people doing so. I find it hard to believe that the United Kingdom did not begin this practice until some 40 to 50 years after the rest of the Western world did so. The monogamous marriage model had many flaws, and the sexual revolutionaries are correct in pointing them out, but this model is also the best solution yet discovered to the problems presented by the asymmetrical investments that men and women make in the process of reproduction for all of its trade-offs. There was wisdom in the traditional model, Louise, and here's an excerpt from what she has to say in her article. The monogamous marriage model had many flaws, and the sexual revolutionaries are correct in this model allows mothers and children to be physically together while at the same time providing financial support for it in an age when labor-saving devices such as washing machines and gas boilers are readily available. Traditionally, the father was primarily responsible for earning money, and the mother was responsible for caring for the children at home. It has become less time-consuming to run a household, and as a result, it is more feasible for mothers of young children to work outside the home as the majority of us do. However, attempting to play the successful role of mother and father simultaneously as single mothers are forced to do is close to impossible, particularly on low wages. A single mother can't take care of a successful family all by her. So what does she do? She begins by arguing that feminists are both right and wrong about marriage, and then she goes on to argue that weddings are too expensive in today's society, to the point where couples are unable to be married until they have saved enough money for a lavish ceremony. She also places the responsibility on men, claiming that all we care about is our sexual activity and our companions, and that men are terrified of commitment when it comes to getting married. This woman is not pleading for a return to the institution of the traditional marriage. In point of fact, it seems as though she is laying the blame on males. Keep in mind that the top 5 to 10% of guys aren't participating in very much sexual activity. What about if she criticized the women those men are sleeping with, saying that they are too willing to give sex away, but she doesn't do that. She also has a response, and here it is. In addition, I will quote her, "In order to change the incentive structure, we would require a technology that discourages short-termism in male sexual behavior, protects the economic interests of the mother, and creates a stable environment for the raising of children. And we already have such a technology, even if it's old, clunky, and prone to periodic failure. It's called monogamous marriage." Quote, "But when I hear that, all I hear is that women have their economic needs met through marriage and children have a good environment. However, the giga-chads lose out on the sexual variety factor. This is what I hear. For males in this situation, returning to the concept of the traditional marriage is a step backward. In addition, you are unable to coerce them into getting married. Anyways, you also can't force them to not go around and sleep with married women and wreck their relationships in that way either. In any case, let's get back to publicly embarrassing giga-chad. The Return of the Clown global show in the wedding chapel, Louis devotes the most of the piece to appeasing feminists and smacking their enormous posteriors by pointing out how many compelling arguments the feminists have presented. In addition to this, she talks about how, beginning with Generation Z in the United States, there is currently a sexual counter-revolution. Yeah, I don't believe. You are not going to be successful in persuading those who ride the carousel while wearing cooches to give up riding. You are not going to take away Chad's never-ending horror thing, either. She continues to humiliate men by saying things like this, and I will quote her. "The other half of the population is forced to literally bear the consequences of a sexual encounter that goes wrong, while the first half of the population consists of people who are significantly more physically imposing, who are significantly more interested in pursuing casual sex, and who will never be able to get pregnant. Because of the way our biology works, when sex unexpectedly results in pregnancy, as it still often does despite modern contraception, it'll always be the woman left cradling the kid, as the saying goes. More shaming language and guilt to get us back to the altar it seems, but women can always dump that bag of cells by simply getting an abortion. What she's trying to say is that the women are going to be the ones left holding the bag, and that's what she's trying to get across. In addition to this, she grouses about how rosy the future appears to be for the offspring of people whose parents were never married in the first place. It is approximately twice as likely for parents who have never been married to part ways as it is for married parents to do so. When this occurs, children are left with the option of growing up in a family with only one parent or moving in with one of the step-parents, typically the stepfather. When I hear something like that, the only thing that goes through my mind is, would someone please think about the children? She wants such men to get married for the sake of the rugrats and the well-being of the women, but what about the man leaving himself vulnerable to divorce rape and thus having his life ruined by doing so? Doesn't anyone else hear that it sounds like shaming language targeting men that are living in common law relationships with kids that are unmarried? Doesn't anyone else hear that it sounds like shaming language targeting men? At the end of the piece, Louise discusses an additional article that was published in Vice magazine. This article was about something that is known as radical monogamy, which is just another rebranding of marriage and monogamy. Previously, feminists dismantled marriage, but now they have suddenly rediscovered it and relabeled it as if it were their own idea. During the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s, the primary focus was on freeing women from the constraints of traditional marriage. Now it appears that they want it back, but under a different name so that they can avoid the appearance of being foolish for giving up on it in the first place. There has been a slight decline in divorce rates not because of a genuine return to marital longevity, but rather because you can't get divorced if you don't get married in the first place, and marriage rates have not stopped falling. This is what Louise says about divorce rates, and I quote her. There's been a slight decline in divorce rates not because of a genuine return to marital longevity. In 1968, 8% of all children were born to parents who were not married in 2019. This percentage has decreased to 7% in 2019. It was almost half the institution of marriage as it once was is now more or less dead, unquote. Of course, it's dead. Who wants this sort of Damocles of divorce hanging over their heads, waiting to fall on them at any minute? Not me. Why would a guy put his own life in jeopardy for the sake of the woman who is no longer his wife? It would appear that all of a sudden, Louise and a lot of other women have become aware of the problem that is the household headed by a single mother. She says the following, and I quote her. Despite the often valiant efforts of single mothers, the data clearly shows that on average children without biological fathers at home do not do as well as other children. These children have higher incarceration rates for boys, higher rates of teen pregnancy for girls, and a greater likelihood of emotional and behavioral problems for both sexes. Here's what she says, and I quote her, despite the often valiant efforts of single mothers, the data clearly shows that on average children without this is due to the fact that single mothers are expected to take on the nearly insurmountable responsibility of doing everything individually. All of the child-rearing responsibilities, including providing care, fostering socialization, and instilling discipline. It would appear that a good number of women have either come to the conclusion that their grown children are a source of embarrassment and will not be useful idiots and utilities to them in their later years, or that they have understood that they will be forced to spend their lives as single mothers in impoverished conditions. They are in desperate need of rescue, yet no one is coming to save them. They appear to have a requirement for a male utility. They are working harder to provide a better life for themselves and their children with the money they earn. If this is the case, then why is the mainstream media suddenly concerned about rising birth rates? Is it because women are struggling to raise their children on their own? Is it possible that the low fertility rates are the driving force behind the government's desire to encourage people of British origin to have more children? I believe that at its core, this is nothing more than a desire to subjugate men in order to relieve the government of the financial burden of supporting single moms. The individual who forwarded this article to me, whose name is Justin, makes the following statement, which I quote, "Why risk so much with marriage when you can just have a relationship? If that's what you genuinely want to do." Women don't want to accept responsibility for their actions. It's a feminist stronghold full of non-men who won't even step foot inside to get married. They point the finger at non-resident fathers who do not pay their child support obligations in full and call them deadbeat dads. Do you really think that most women agree to only being able to sleep with one man for the rest of their lives, or that the Chads agree to the same? Justin also points out the part where Louise says that there is wisdom in the traditional model. Of course, there is wisdom in the traditional model because it is the foundation of civilization. However, he really thinks that most women agree to only be able to sleep with one man for the rest of their lives. The benefits of utilizing the beta male providers were far too tremendous to ignore if one wanted to maintain the status quo in their culture. Now, instead of honoring men with marriage and providing them both the rewards and the obligations that come along with it, they were making marriage a curse for males. The foundations of civilization are starting to become unstable. You can't take away the motivations for guys to get married and expect them to continue to value the institution. This article does not show women begging men to get married. Rather, it shows that women simply want the benefits that they gave up as a result of marriage. However, there is no discussion about dismantling family courts and giving custody of the children to the father if the mother breaks her wedding vows, which is the standard practice. She was the one who lost everything back then in the past, because there were consequences to her terrible conduct. However, our soy side, he does not hold women responsible for their own actions. When something goes wrong, women are quick to point the finger at others and often avoid taking responsibility for their own actions. Putting accountability back in the hands of women would be the best course of action to take if there is any chance of our society regaining even a modicum of its former normalcy. When things go well, the woman is the one who gets the credit for them. But when things go poorly, the man is the one who gets the blame. This causes men to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. Men will only participate in fixed games for a certain amount of time before giving up and going our separate ways. That is something that our culture and a lot of the coochies in the world fail to recognize. There are bounds to the sexual hunger of men. Even Louise, the author of The Trap Thought, who is from the United Kingdom, believes that what men want is sexual variety. Perhaps only the men that she actually wants to get together with hold this belief, but the typical beta is content to be with the same woman for the rest of his life. If Louise believes that the only thing men want is sexual diversity, and that this is the reason why we aren't getting married, then she clearly doesn't understand men. She seems to fall into the same trap as other women, seeing men not as human beings, but simply as human doings that are only values as utilities for women and children. That is precisely what women are begging for men to return to being utilities for women and children, and she is trying to trick us into doing that by using guilt to get us to marry. If we are already in common law relationships, or to make us feel bad like those poor men on the Titanic, who gave both their seats and their lives to the women and children, all I have to say the feminists out there is come back to men, me excluded, when you're ready to make some real concessions and have all the girls work together to repeal the rights women were given in exchange for male attention and provision. If we are already in common law relationships, or to make us feel bad like those poor men on the Titanic, because at this point that is probably the only thing that will genuinely bring you ladies back to the bargaining table, I hope that the government becomes bankrupt bringing in useless migrants into Britain. Anyways, that wraps up my thoughts for the day.